give everyone a background so that everyone is caught up. So I want to give you the basically the storyline of the book, since that's what people know the most. In the fictional series, it's historic fictions, it is about a little girl named Laura with her ma and pa and her older sister Mary and her other sisters Grace and Carrie. Growing up in starting in the 1860s and going through till about the late 1880s as pioneers, basically some of the first settlers in the area. So she grew up, she was in the series, she turned 6 years old in Pepin, Wisconsin. So we know where Pepin is, you know, way up closer to the Twin Cities along the Mississippi, in a little house in the big woods. She moves to Kansas to look for a Little House on the Prairie series. She then moves to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, which is southwest Minnesota, on the banks of Plum Creek. And then she heads to De Smet, South Dakota for the final books of the series. She gets married and she lives happily ever after. Isn't that nice? All right, so let's talk about what really kind of happened. And I'm going to start, because we're going to be talking about Pa, I want to kind of talk a little bit about Pa's background. So Pa, you know, we actually could probably, you know, scooch up a little bit. This is story time, so I feel like I'm really behind. So Pa, since we're focusing on him, Pa was born in 1836 in Cuba, New York. And that's in upstate New York. So pretty close to Canada, actually. He had French-Canadian relatives. So did you want to scooch up? Or did I make you too comfortable and now you don't want to scooch up?
You gonna wake me up?
Yeah, I'm gonna wake you up. Wake up, Charlie. So, so when he was about 8, we think, we're not exactly sure, his family would have moved, would have traveled from upstate New York on land down to the Chicago area and would have ended up in near Elgin, Illinois. In fact, he ended up where he lived at that time from like 8 till about 15. There is a farm called the Garfield Farm, which is a historic farm. As it happens, Pa lived just down the road, and they do have a marker there that kind of commemorates that. So if people are hanging out in Elgin, Campton Hills, or what have you, Illinois, you kind of see where Pa grew up. And this is where he would have gotten his chops as a fiddler. So he went to the dances at the Garfield house, and so this would have been the age where he would have learned his fiddling and learned his tunes. And so he was what we call a Yankee or a Yorker. He had the English, Scottish, French-Canadian background, and he was coming west because Wisconsin and Minnesota was the west at the time, right? And he's coming at the same time that a lot of other immigrants are coming, right? So that's why we kind of distinguish the Yankees versus the Scandinavian, Irish, you know, Eastern European, all the other immigrants coming kind of at the same time. So then in around 1844, I believe, they traveled from Elgin, Illinois. They went up the Fox River, a different Fox River, up the Fox River to Concord. And if you ever travel between Milwaukee and Madison, and you get off on F to use the mobile station there, that's where he was. How convenient, right? You go down one more stop and take a right, and that's right. This is the farm that they lived on. And the little town of Concord is on the other side of the freeway, and actually if you get off you can kind of see the little town. They have a historical society, and they actually do have some of the letters and things that were written by the family that are at that site. So obviously it was easier for them to get to Concord because there wasn't this interstate right in the middle, so it's a little hard to see now, but that's how it was. Well, his family moved right next door to the neighboring farm to the Quiner family, which was Carolyn Quiner, so Ma. She grew up in Brookfield, and then they moved west to the farm in Concord. So that's where the Quiners met the Ingalls. So obviously there was dancing, so it talked a lot about dancing and courtship going on. So Pa Charles married Carolyn, and his brother Peter married Eliza. And so Peter and Eliza show up later in the series, but so 2 brothers married 2 sisters, not unusual at the time. And in 1863, then the two brothers and their brides and the parents of Caroline, I actually believe it was a mother and stepfather, because I think my understanding is her father died in a shipwreck in Lake Michigan, another fun story. So as you dive into this, there's all kinds of little fun side stories. Anyway, so in 1863, they took off to Pepin. So there's a lot of, Laura never talks about why her parents left, that sort of thing, but it just so happens that that's when Wisconsin developed the draft for the Civil War. And so, so not every state did, and so they'd had a family member that had been in the Civil War, came back, not quite the same. So the family was, the story was nobody wanted to be like, I think it was, and she kind of depicts a crazy uncle in the books, and she's kind of written it off as this crazy, I think it's Crazy Uncle George. I don't think it really was George, but she kind of writes about a crazy uncle, and it's like, yeah, that was the crazy uncle who was never quite right after the Civil War. So they took off, and they went to Pepin. If you guys are familiar with the Pepin area, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. It's part of the Driftless, very hilly, right next to the Mississippi. If you wanted to go somewhere where no one would find you, that's the place to go. I still get lost in Pepin, and I know where I'm going, and I have GPS. GPS doesn't work, it's great. So if you're gonna go take off and not be found, that's a great place to go, because not only did they take off to Pepin to avoid the draft, there were people in Minnesota who were scared off by the Indian wars that were happening, the Indian uprising that was happening in Mankato. They all took off east. So actually Pepin was a really hopping place for a while there, because people were really terrified. So they all hung out there. So anyway, so that's Pepin's claim to fame. It's where you go if you are scared. So, and you need to hide. So apparently that's it. So, Laura, in the books, she needed to, so that's where they end up in Pepin. All right. So Laura's actually born in Pepin, but in the books she's a 6-year-old in Pepin. And so what happened was that Laura Ingalls Wilder's actually in her later years, she wrote her autobiography. And with all of these wonderful, realistic stories in them, because she did grow up on the frontier, and she had a lot of harrowing experiences, and she saw a lot of real life things. But when she talked to her agent, they didn't think it was appropriate for a woman to be writing those kinds of stories, that she should be writing children's books. So she rewrote her autobiography as a children's series, but they also then said, well, you can't be an infant and be telling your story. We want you to tell it in the first person. So that meant she had to be 6 in Pepin. And so she then had to fudge the rest of her life. So she wanted to end up being married to her husband and happily ever after by De Smet, so she had to kind of just squinch all of the years a little bit and kind of drop out. She had to drop out the part about Iowa, because we just know Iowa, right? So she couldn't talk about Baroque. We just don't talk about Baroque. Anyway, so she had to kind of squish them all in, so that she ended up in her life seemed like it had this natural, normal progression. What really happened was that they ended up in Pepin. It's where she was born. Pa decided that he wanted to take off to Kansas, because he thought the territory was opening up there. He ended up on Osage Indian land, illegally trespassing on Osage, knowingly illegally trespassing on Osage land. He was betting that the military was gonna come and push out the natives, because that's what they've been doing all along. Well, they didn't. So he only lasted a year, and he was lucky to leave alive, because the I'm just impressed that the Osage didn't just kill him, you know, because it sounded like they wanted to. Anyway, so he hightails it back to Pepin, because the guy who had bought their house couldn't make the payment, so they ended up back at the house. So that's where so she made that little jaunt. They then leave again, and they end up in Walnut Grove. And so they end up in Walnut Grove for a couple years, but then the grasshoppers come, right? So they got 2 years worth of grasshoppers. And darn it, those grasshoppers, had he stayed in Pepin, he'd have been fine. But the grasshoppers didn't go that far east. But man, he had grasshoppers. So the plague. So he ended up having to go back to north of Rochester, kind of the Zumbro River. They camped along the Zumbro River because his brother Peter and Eliza stayed in that area. So there is a cautionary tale to all of this. You know, Peter and Eliza stayed in the Pepin, Pierce, Minnesota area. Anyway, during the time that Pa's bouncing around. So he has this really great deal. He's going to go down to Burr Oak, Iowa. Awesome. So he goes down to Burr Oak, Iowa, because he's going to work at a hotel. Well, that's where Laura ends up dealing with. She's working at the hotel. She's just a kid. She's dealing with drunks. She's dealing with all kinds of unseemly behavior happening at the hotel. She talks about it in her autobiography. There's actually a childless family tries to buy Laura from her parents because they told her parents, oh, you can just have more children. So Laura's kind of freaked, right? So like if my parents really need money, they're just gonna sell me? And apparently this was a thing that happened. So anyway, so Burr Oak wasn't a really great experience for them. Pa ended up in debt and arguing over his bills. So they packed up in the middle of the night and took back to, headed back to Walnut Grove. So they just skipped town. So that whole part of her life was left out of the books. As you can well understand. So Pa ends up back in Walnut Grove. He then, he's there, and then one of the family members gets him a job with the railroad, because the railroad's starting to move west, and they're starting to move into South Dakota, because we've got the Homestead Act, and there's more and more people that are moving into South Dakota, because isn't South Dakota just the best farmland ever, right? Bad public policy. But at any rate, so they all are gonna go and make their fortune in South Dakota. Yeah, it's great. So that didn't work out well, but they ended up going, and he ended up working on the railroad, and they ended up in Dismount. And so there, Laura kind of talks more stories about herself. She does meet her husband, Almanzo, and they don't live happily ever. Well, they stay married. They love each other. But what happens is they get married. They have a little girl. They have a second child, a boy who dies. And their house burns down, their crops fail, they become deathly ill. They're lucky to have survived. So here they are, broke. Almanzo never fully recovers from his illness, and so they gotta leave. So they go back to Almanzo's parents in Spring Grove, Minnesota for a while. Then they think that Florida is gonna be a really good idea. They try that for a year and then they come back. So they finally decide that Missouri is the place to go, right? Go down to Missouri for his health, because Almanzo just can't, he's got to have a smaller farm, he's got to have better climate. So they end up in Mansfield, Missouri for the rest of their lives. So they moved to Mansfield. Rose is still, their daughter is still a little girl, and they moved there at around 1900, and they lived there until they passed away. Laura was 90 when she passed away in 1957. So she really lived in Missouri, her whole time. So never had a whole lot of money. She did do some writing. She wrote for, she did odd jobs. She did, she did eggs, and she did, they did a lot of specialty things. But she wrote a column for the Missouri Ruralist, so she got her kind of dabbled in writing. And her daughter, Rose, ended up being a very well-known author at the time, award-winning. Very controversial, got sued a lot for plagiarizing and writing unauthorized biographies. And if you really want a great soap opera story, the story of Laura and her daughter Rose is awesome. Those two, they love each other, they hate each other. It's just like oh my gosh. But they're both very successful women and very determined, and it's an interesting story. So at any rate, so Rose is becoming this well-known author, well-written. Laura is dabbling in, she's doing her writing for her column. She decides that she's pining for the old days in her memory, and she's 63 years old, and she decides that she's going to write about her childhood. So she starts writing to family members. She's doing as much as she can from memory. She still has an aunt that's living in Plainview, Minnesota. It's not too far from Rochester. So she's getting a lot of stories from her aunt, and to make sure she's got facts and figures and stuff. So she's doing that, and she starts working with her daughter on her daughter is doing heavily editing her stories, and her daughter's using her publishing contacts to introduce her to her agents. So that's where the Little House on the Prairie series is born. It's really a collaboration between mother and daughter. They're living in Missouri, and it is many, many years after her childhood, and she's trying to come up with this. They decided that the books would sell better if they told them they were autobiographical, and they were completely true. So Rose went to her deathbed saying that the Laura II stories were absolutely autobiographical and absolutely true. But you know what? People were starting to catch on because the math wasn't working. And some of the things were like, I don't know. So Rose went to her deathbed swearing that they were absolutely true. So what happened was there was sort of this, and then the TV series came about, right after they died, the TV series came about. And so Michael Landon, who was a producer, man, he started with some of the stuff from the books, and then he just wrote. They did stories from Bonanza. They added characters. They filmed it all in California. They got mountains in the background. It's like, have you been to Walnut Grove? Yeah, been. It's like prairie. It is flat as far as the eye can see. So anyway, so there wasn't a whole lot authentic. It was a charming TV series, and if you're a fan, that's fine. But it's very fanciful. So this then spawned a tremendous amount of fan curiosity as to what really happened. Okay, because the fans had been sort of deceived, and they were starting to wonder what really happened. So the organization that I belong to, called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Research and Legacy Association, was formed of people who like to study the history of the Laura books and all the adjacent histories that go along with it. They dive into the families and into the politics and into the environment and the culture, and there's just so many books, really fun books that have been written about all these kinds of things. So one of the things that I started to wonder, because many of you know that I've been doing a lot of upper Midwest fiddling. That's kind of my thing, is upper Midwest stuff. And Pa was an upper Midwest fiddler. He lived his whole life in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and South Dakota, what we call the upper Midwest. So I became really curious as to what kinds of tunes he played. Because the tunes that are depicted in the book are a lot of them are tunes of the day, popular hymns, popular gospel songs, but I don't know, as an upper Midwest fiddler, they somehow just weren't striking me as, it seemed to me like there was something more, right? There had to be something more. Somehow it just wasn't, making sense to me. And I talked to a fellow musician, and she said, wouldn't it be great if Pa had actually met some of the fiddlers that we're studying and for upper Midwest, music? And I was like, wait, wait. You're making a good point there. So that became this intersection of some of the stuff that I was studying and some of where I learned more about Pa's travel. It's like, I think that some of these influences probably did intersect. The other thing that I was really noticing was the fact that Rose and Laura lived most of their life, Rose all of her life really, and Laura most of her life in Missouri. And so it seemed to me the books just had a really Southern influence, right? I just seemed to feel like they just kind of had, and we noticed that, right? It's the kind of thing no one else would notice, but we would, because it just sounded kind of Southern. And so when I realized that that's where the books were written, and that Laura never became a musician herself, but always loved music, she'd go to the local dances, she enjoyed listening to the stuff. So she and Rose, of course, that's the only exposure she had. So it seemed like some of the dances and the music and the things that were being written about were probably more like the Ozarks. So I'm just thinking this is my imagination, right? I'm trying to be open-minded. So then Charlie's like, oh, Phil Jameson's got this great book called Hoedown's Frolics and Reels. I think you told me about it. Yeah, great. Okay, yeah, you got it all about the history of dance in Southern Appalachia. All right, yeah, okay, gotta read this book. So I'm reading this book, and Phil makes 3 references to Laura and Little House on the Prairie about the dances and the music, and his assumption is that that means that the dances from the South made their way north. So I hate to be the one that bursts Phil Jameson's bubble, because who am I? But at some point I do need to write him a letter and say, or Laura's hanging out in the Ozarks and she's writing what she sees, and Rose is heavily editing this, and so she's writing a lot of the stuff. So some of the stuff, so I'm like, okay. So these books are written with a strong filter of Ozarks culture, so we gotta kind of look through that. So back in, was it 2019, the Laura Ingalls Wilders Research and Legacy Association, all right, they have the world's worst acronym, it doesn't spell anything, it's like really hard to remember, but they have the best name for a conference. They call it Laura Palooza, and they do it every few years, and it's just worth it. So people are invited, and you just do it for free, it's for fun, but people are invited to present ideas and for presentations, and they come and do presentations on literally every aspect you can think of related to the Little House book. So I came, and we went when it was in La Crosse, and we did a presentation because I had been learning some of this stuff, and I was telling them that I don't think this stuff is really what you think it is, and there were people who were really quite surprised. I did surprise people. In fact, they came up to me and said, "You've kind of given us something to think about. We thought that what was in the book was so totally accurate." But like, well, maybe not. So I gave them a lot to think about, and it also gave me a lot more information, some more references. So I've continued to do some reading, and so we're going to be going back again in July, and so I really would appreciate this opportunity, because this gave me a chance to sort of brush off my previous research, because I have continually kind of updated things, kind of brush it off and kind of practice, and because we're doing another presentation in Sioux Falls in July, and we'll be adding in, when we went in La Crosse, we got them up to like Wisconsin, Minnesota years, so we're going to add in the South Dakota years. The really fun part about that is that that's where Pa does a blackface minstrel show, so we get to talk about that. Yay! So that's going to be a fun one that we'll have to kind of explain how that's just a challenging area for those of us who like old-time music. We appreciate the tradition, but we also can appreciate how hurtful that can be. So at any rate, so I'll be in 10 minutes or less telling them about how to handle the whole minstrel scene. But any rate, so I then had to ask the question, so what did Pa really play? So what was stuff that because she put in a lot of tunes in the book, so were those real or not? One of the other things I learned since our presentation in 2019 was that there's a gentleman who put together a whole bunch of letters that he collected from Laura and a whole bunch of people. At any rate, one of the letters was a letter that between her and her agent, the publisher, between her and the publisher, and they were talking about the tunes in the book, and the lawyers were saying, we need to make sure that whatever music you mention, we have rights to. I'm like, whoa, that actually makes a tremendous amount of sense. So, because if you Google the top tunes of those years, you're going to find those are the ones that are mentioned in the books, and it's probably also the ones that they had the rights to. So there was a whole level of legal editing, and she told them, "You are right. I don't want to get the publishing company in trouble. I don't want to have my book not published because of this legal thing. You put in what you're able to put in." So she basically gave right to edit to the legal department and the publisher, and I thought, well, now that puts a whole other wrinkle on it. So you got this whole Ozark thing, plus you got the publishing company telling you what you can and can't put in. And so then it's like, aha, this is where I'm thinking like, maybe this isn't it. The other thing is that Rose is as she gets older, she becomes one of the founders of the Libertarian Party. So she has some really strong political viewpoints. This is the 1930s. She doesn't like Roosevelt. She doesn't like Social Security. She doesn't like a lot of the stuff. So this political tone starts to show up in the books. So that one of the things they did was they wanted to show the Ingalls family as being this very strong, self-sufficient, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If Laura did it, you can do it, you know. and that was what they wanted to portray. So it wasn't necessarily that they lied, they fudged stuff. They didn't say lie about stuff, but they sure erased a lot. So we all know that at that time there's all of these people who were showing up in the upper Midwest with their fiddles, all these different cultures and all these different groups, and they're just only little minor characters here and there. There were a whole lot more of them than they talk about. So Paul clearly was influenced a lot by all of these other kinds of cultures. So I thought, I gotta take that into consideration, that they just kind of erased a lot of this stuff. And they were far more reliant on their neighbors and their community and on the government than they ever let on, but they just wanted to say that. So that's the only way they were able to survive, was because they got some help and they got some assistance. So knowing that all of these things kind of color, you know, the whole thing, I then was like, okay, so what did Paul play? So the fun part of the puzzle was to then say, well, if he was in Elgin, Illinois, that area, well, who was there at the time? So I looked at the census, and most of the names in the census were all English, Scottish, you know, French, Canadian. Okay, so that's his influence. That's going to be the music he said. So then you got to find music from the 1830s and 40s that were that kind of background. So we found this book, a series of books called Howe's Musicians Omnibus. Have you guys heard of the Howe's books? Oh my gosh, what a great way to spend COVID. So Elias Howe, who was a cousin of the sewing machine manufacturer, he put together, he's self-published, or maybe he finally got a publisher. He put it together himself. I thought he sold them door to door. Yeah. I don't remember that part of it.
They were published.
Yeah, they were published. So he put together these in the starting in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, you know, I think up to about the 1870s. He put together these huge collections of books that he sold to the public, tune books. And they were very eclectic. They're very fun. They're all on the internet if you ever want to look at them. There's 7 volumes, and he's got even additional books that he's got out there. They're very eclectic. He'll give you a snippet of an aria from an opera. He'll give you notes for a marching band tune. He'll give you a bunch of fiddle tunes. He'll do dance sets at the end. I mean, he has what he calls Ethiopian tunes, which would be the minstrel tunes. So it's just, you know, Irish tunes, which aren't necessarily Irish tunes. It's just what he thinks are Irish tunes. So it's great. I mean, it's like the most eclectic tune book on the piano tune. I mean, it's wonderful because it's called Howe's, Howe, musicians, apostrophe S, musicians omnibus. Yeah, and then he did one before that, musician's companion.
You said there were 7?
Yeah. And they're on the internet, and they're all, at any rate, they're fun. They're hard to read, but they're fun to look at. So we figured if those tunes were around, so then we thought, okay, well, this is like a huge book, right? Fortunately, we also found a fiddler by the name of Iva Dingwald, and Iva Dingwald was a contemporary of Laura. She was born in 1877 and died in 1967, about the same. So she was only about 10 years younger than Laura, so would be a contemporary. And she grew up in Elk River, Minnesota, which is northwest of the cities. Pepin would have been southeast of the city, so kind of in that same part of the planet. She ended up moving to Superior, Wisconsin, becoming a music teacher, and that's where she lived for the rest of her life. But she grew up as a kid, having her dad, Andrew, taking her to all of the dances. He would make money playing fiddle at the dances. And she learned. He got a little bit of money, and that got her music lessons, and she learned how to play the fiddle. So unlike Laura, who didn't know the tunes, she knew the tunes. So she wrote down her story as well, which is at the Minnesota History Center. And so she wrote down, and she included tunes, and bless her heart, before she passed away in the 1950s, she did reel-to-reel recordings of these tunes. I'm like, yes. And these tunes we found were all in house. So we're like, yes. So anyway, so it's really only one, and I guess I'm kind of pulling at straws, but at least I got one, right? So I took all her scratchy recordings, which also are out on the internet, scratchy recording, and transcribed them, replayed them I got them all on YouTube, so they're all up there. And there should be a link in the String Gathering website to the Iva Dingwald tune book. So that's one. So that should be all the tunes from the Yankee or Yorker tradition, because that's her father, who would have been a peer, a contemporary of Pa. His family moved from New York. So someone who would have had a similar background, similar story, came to the similar part of the world, also did dances, and this is what he played. So it was fun to kind of hear. So a lot of what we think that he would have played at that time would have been from Iva Dingwald. When he was in Pepin, he would have been surrounded by Swedes. I mean, literally surrounded by Swedes. They had so many Swedes, they had to actually mention them in the book. You couldn't not talk about the Swedes. But I don't really know a lot about what tunes were brought over by the first generation of immigrants from Sweden. But my pal Renee Vaughn is working on this project called Nordic Newcomers, where she's doing exactly that. She's tracing back first generation Swedish immigrants and finding out what were the first tunes that they brought. She's having the same fun and luck that I'm having, because it's a long time ago, but I'm hopeful that at some point, as she works with her research, that there may be some tunes that we could pull out that would be Swedish tunes that he probably would have heard from fiddlers, because he was so close to them. He had to have heard some Swedish tunes. But they do talk in her autobiography, she did talk about her Irish neighbor. Now, Irish neighbor does show up in the books a little bit. I think because she gets in a fight with the sons of the Irish neighbor. I think that's why. But at any rate, Laura was a handful. But in her autobiography, she talked about a dance at the Irish neighbors that Pa played for. So then it means that Pa also knew some tunes that would probably have been like Irish, Scottish, English. Because the Irish at that time didn't play a lot of what we consider the Irish traditional music, because the English were trying to wipe out Irish culture and the Irish. That's why they came here. So that whole trend, that whole wave of getting back to Irish traditional music didn't happen until about 1900, so that's a little bit later. So Mr. Hewitt, the Irish neighbor, probably just knew a bunch of Scottish tunes, because that's kind of what they would have known. The Irish didn't even know their own traditional music. But Howes did put together what he called the Hibernia collection, which is the Latin for Ireland, whatever, which is all full of English and Scottish tunes, as you would expect. And so, it gives us a little bit of a notion of what kinds of tunes he might have played with his Irish neighbor. So we know he had those influences. Then when he got to, I don't think he had much influence from Kansas, because honestly, he was just there long enough to build a house and leave with his life and family intact. So he wasn't there really long enough there weren't a lot of people. He was kind of on his own there. So I don't think he had a lot of musical influences there, but he certainly would have in Walnut Grove. He hung around in Walnut Grove enough that he was involved in the community, and there were a lot of Norwegians in Walnut Grove, like a lot. So that's where the Norwegians started coming in. So as it happens, I also worked on a project of going through the collection of music that Elmo Wick, who was an avid fiddler and tune collector from West Central Minnesota. And he had all the tunes Elmo died in 2009, and he had not only his own tunes, but he had collected his dad's tunes and his grandfather's tunes and all the neighbors' tunes. kind of everybody from this community that was about 90 miles north of Walnut Grove. So the same kind of thing like with Iva, you know, not right in that community, but at least that same part of the planet. So there are two of the fiddlers that are in his collection that would have been contemporaries, but one for sure is a contemporary pop. His name is Elling Sagadal. And so any tunes from Elling Sagadal would have been a Norwegian tune that would have been there at the time. And Elmo Wick's grandfather also would have been, you know, at the time. So I have all, like I said, I got all these tunes and things. So I'm just kind of like piecing together all these kinds of little sort of things to see what did he actually play, what did he actually do, what wasn't heavily edited by his granddaughter and heavily edited by, you know, his daughter to see what kinds of more tunes were actually played. I gotta see if I missed anything. I wrote down all my notes and I did it by memory. Well, there we go. So I think those are all the influence. I didn't miss any, did I? No. So basically, what she has in the books are probably, they're all the popular tunes of the day and the popular hymns of the day. So it is likely that he played them. So if they're in the books, it's likely he played them. But he probably played, he was a prolific fiddler, and so she makes references to Pa fiddled the night away, Pa fiddled, Pa did a lot more fiddling than she just makes general references, and so he wasn't playing, 12 tunes the whole time, right? He probably knew a whole lot more, and he's probably picking up stuff from the neighbors. And she was a little girl, she wouldn't necessarily know what Pa was doing when he's hanging out in town. Ma would have known, but yeah, she didn't know. So here was as I told you, this is the cautionary tale. So after all of these great adventures, great stories, and all this stuff, Pa does pass away in DeSmet in 1902. And his no one in his family. Rose was his only grandchild, and Rose never had living children. She had one child who passed away, so there are no descendants of that family. Peter and Eliza, however, stayed in Wisconsin. Smart. Ended up doing quite well. And so if you go and hang out in western Wisconsin, you're gonna find Ingalls there. And they're all related, but they're all related to Peter and Eliza. So they're all still there, hanging out in Pepin and Red Wing. And so I became very involved with the Pepin Laura days and their fiddle contest and all their activities and things like that. It was great fun to go there because you'd hang out at Laura days, and I tell you, every year there were at least 3-4 people who'd come up and say, "Oh, I don't think I ever told you, I'm a cousin of so and so. I'm related. And it was like, how are all these people related? No one lived, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. I was all through that line. Even the director of the museum was an Ingalls. And so, yeah, so it's like, so there's a whole lot of Ingalls around. They are all related, but it's because the brother and his wife stayed in Wisconsin. So, cautionary tale. No, don't become a fiddler. Okay.
So obviously Peter didn't play fiddle?
You know what? They never mentioned that.
Charles's father, do we know where he learned it as a kid?
You know what? They don't. And I get asked this, the two questions I get asked by the Laura enthusiast is, when would he have learned how to play fiddle, and where would he have gotten his fiddle? And to me, those are questions that just have obvious answers. Everybody played fiddle or guitar. I mean, they played an instrument. So he just would have picked it up because there would have been so many fiddlers. This isn't like something rare like today. This is not some unusual activity. This is something everybody did. And so I thought, well, that's not a surprise that he knew all these tunes. The other was, where did he get his fiddle? And it's like, there were fiddles everywhere. So it's like he probably got one handed down, whatever. Autumn, yeah, they were kind of everywhere. So, so I don't find that as much of a puzzle as some of the other, Laura enthusiasts, because I just think there were so many fiddlers and fiddle tunes around.
So it might be more interesting if Peter didn't do music, or if Peter and Liza
weren't. No kidding. Yeah. You know what?
Or didn't Charles have sisters? They're the aunts or is it the Pointer sisters?
Yeah.
There's the aunts of
Right.
the cheering off dance.
Right. So they all sang, and they all danced. So there's a lot of singing and dancing that went on. But Pa's the only one that's mentioned at a fiddle. You know what? That is a really good observation. I wonder if that's one of those things that was erased. Like you make Pa more obvious by erasing all the other musicians in his life. Like he was special and unique. So it's like, well, no, he wasn't special and unique. He was a fiddler. Everybody fiddles. It was the thing you did. Now, he would have been one of the better ones because he was asked to fiddle and people commented on his fiddling, you know, because there were a lot of people who fiddle and they weren't all that good, right? You know, so they're not the ones you wrote stories about. So the fact, so you know, usually the fiddlers that we hear about were probably the better ones because they're the ones who were asked to come to dances and asked to play and asked, you know, people wanted to hear the music and know more about them. They weren't the people who were just like,
You know, those Pa's fiddle collections, you know, that CDs and things like that, is that all based on tunes that Laura called out in the House books? Or?
So I made somebody cry at Lollapalooza in 2019. So what happened with Pa's Fiddle is they took the fictional series and they took every tune that was mentioned at the fictional series.
So on the TV series?
Yeah, the book series, in the book series.
Okay.
So they took every tune that was mentioned and they decided to record it, which is a really great idea, except what they did is they hired a bluegrass band and they recorded it in Nashville, Tennessee. And so put out the CD collection that all the Laura enthusiasts were so excited about the CD collection. We were looking forward to it. It finally came out and there's a Facebook page. There's a Facebook page called Old Time Music of the Upper Midwest. And so when the Pa's Fiddle Project CDs came out, the first comment was the administrator basically just said, WTF ? Which was the universal response of everyone that I talked to from like Minnesota, Wisconsin. Everyone was like, well, you took a bunch of old-time tunes and you gave them to a bluegrass band, and there's nothing wrong with that. Don't be telling me this is authentic, and you recorded in Nashville, and you made a PBS special about it, but there's nothing, this is not us. So I had to tell them at this, in my presentation, kind of give them a timeline of music, and I'm like, hey, none of this, if you like it's like if you like the TV series, if you like the CDs, that's great, but you want to know the historical accuracy, and I'm telling you that you could have had Elvis recording all of his stuff and been about as accurate. And they were all like, what? Look at the timeline, people, look at the timeline. And so that put it in perspective because, so there was a lady who came up to me afterwards and said, when I heard that, I gotta tell you, I cried a little. I also said this, oh my gosh, this is great. So I have all of these people in this room and I said, you know what, when the old time fiddlers heard this collection, it would be a little bit like all of you taking a look at quilts and they're all made out of polyester. And it's like,